Hello and welcome everyone to the Asia Society Policy Institute's webinar on South Asia's Youth Movement, a new generation rewriting the region's politics and shared future. I'm Farwa Aamer, the Director of South Asia Initiatives here at ASPI in New York. It's wonderful to have you all with us. South Asia is home to the largest youth population in the world, making it one of the youngest regions globally. This demographic reality means that young people will increasingly define what the region's political, economic, and social future looks like. And we're already seeing powerful waves of change. In recent years, South Asia's youth have emerged as a decisive political force, reshaping debates around governance, accountability, and leadership. From last year's Gen Z-led movement in Nepal to student protests in Bangladesh in 2024 and to the mass protests in Sri Lanka following the 2022 economic collapse in the country, younger generations are stepping into the public arena in visible and consequential ways. Their priorities, demands, and modes of political participation are already influencing the region's trajectory. As we begin a new year, there is no better moment to hear directly from young voices themselves. Today's conversation will explore how youth across South Asia, primarily Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, envision change, what opportunities they see for their generation, how they define good leadership, and what that means for upcoming elections in countries like Nepal and Bangladesh, and how they imagine a shared regional future amid common challenges and opportunities, whether economic, political, or climate related. To unpack all this and more, I'm delighted to have three incredible panelists with me today, starting with Tanuja Pandey, Nepal's Gen Z leader, lawyer, and climate justice activist. Next, we have Krystle Reid Wijesuriya, Co-Chief Executive Officer at We Are Team Rocket Private Limited. And finally, Shah Rafayat Chowdhury, Co-Founder and President of Footsteps Bangladesh. Thank you for joining me today. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. I'll start with questions on my end for the speakers, and around the 45-minute mark, we'll open the floor for audience questions. So please use the Zoom Q&A box in front of you to send your queries, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in our session today. So without further ado, if I could kick this off with you, Krystle. The Aragalaya movement in 2022 was one of the first in recent waves that we've seen of public, prominently youth-driven uprising against the systems in South Asia. It emerged at a moment of profound economic collapse and in Sri Lanka and ultimately played a decisive role in reshaping the country's political leadership. Looking back now, how do you understand the role young people played in that moment? And building on that, you spent that post-2022 period working very closely with youth through Gen Youth Initiative and supporting underserved communities through Enable Lanka. What shifts have you observed in young people's sense of agency? What's their economic outlook like and their belief in Sri Lanka's future? So I'll hand it over to you, Krystle.
Thank you, Farwa. So, in simple, Aragalaya means a struggle. I just want to give that clarity. Aragalaya in Sinhala is that. So, in 2022, young Sri Lankans did something very radical in this country. Why I say radical is we are often trained not to really challenge the status quo. So, for once, we spoke and we challenged. That's what happened. So, what started off as a very small movement in towns, in cities, gave birth to this massive movement across the island. And at that, all of us knew then regimes, fear-mongering tactics, the brutal history they had. But I guess at that point, there was no fear greater than the fear of survival, right? So we marched and we counted on each other. And that's how this movement began. So what I also want to set at the get-go is Aragalaya was not, or the people's protest was not only because of the fuel queues or the emptied pharmacies, or it wasn't about social media then. What we're talking about is a generational refusal to be silent from what I often call as sovereign families who rule this country like a family business through nepotism. So the movement demonstrated to the leaders and also to the leaders who are planning to come into power at some point that, as our constitution states, the sovereignty of this country will be with its people, and it is an absolute power that we have. So this wasn't a symbolic movement. This was structurally done over a period of time, I would say. So soon after the protest, we saw a number of surveys that came out because you asked about the youth movement and the participation around it. It said more than 25% of Sri Lankan youth personally protested. And even those who couldn't physically join a protest ground did so using social media and peer pressure groups in their own communities. And they say more than 30% had someone from the immediate family on the streets protesting. So this movement is predominantly led by civic-minded youth, thinking of the country's future as opposed to their personal agendas, and it was non-partisan, right? So I remember soon after the President Palace was flooded with people, the media was covering this, and I'm sure you would have seen it as well, where they were saying, oh, look at these Gen Zs, they're swimming in the pool and they're enjoying the amenities at the President's Palace. But hey, amidst all of these things, but what we need to understand is the youth of this country, for the first time, saw the kind of luxuries our leaders were enjoying at our cost, living through our tax money, buying from our tax money. So that frustration goes without saying. So I think that's the kind of nuances sometimes the media fail to highlight in this movement. And there were still those who were not in agreement to the movement as well. I personally had friends and family who reached out saying, well, what an inconvenience this is for us. Well, a protest is an inconvenience because, see, if you are to say a protest is an inconvenience, then you are talking from a very deeply privileged point of view, right? So when the entire country has been pushed to collapse, and if you were to make such statements, that says that you are really not understanding the nuances of the situation or understand the ground realities. So the young people who came forward were not just foot soldiers. They were setting agendas. They were the narrators. They were negotiating. They were the medics on ground. They were the digital broadcasters. They played a much bigger role than someone would want to accept and acknowledge. So for me is the real role of the youth. And it wasn't just a protest. We proved the sovereignty of this people, sovereignty of the people to our leaders. So as you asked me, what changed after 2022? I remember doing one of the very first vote and civic education programs under Gen Youth because we were nearing the elections at that point. There were some of the voters who were first-time voters, extremely disappointed. They had no trust or hope in this system. So there was a lot of convincing. There was a lot of awareness that we had to create in order to reinstate that trust so that they understand it's not just a right, but it is a responsibility that they have across everyone, right? So what I saw was there was so much stronger sense of agency among people. They have moved beyond more reactive measures. There were better civic engagement. They were organizing in their communities, mobilizing. There was digital advocacy programs that were happening, better dialogues. So people also became more creative, especially young people. They were bringing these narratives into communities using art, culture, drama, things that we did not think of using at the beginning, right? So another change of perspective that I saw with the young people is that young people do not wish to frame a prolonged hardship as resilience. By doing this, we are risking and we are normalizing suffering in the communities. We are normalizing disrupted education, loss of income. So what they are seeking for is not resilience, but accountability, more long-term sustainable solutions from our leaders. So, and post people protest, although some have gone back to their original camps, some have moved from camps, and some who are still deciding on which camp should I be in, irrespective of those political ideologies, what we see is what they're asking for is a change of the system. And that is critical. So for me, the Aragalaya did not end in 2022. Rather, it moved from the protesting grounds into classrooms, into cooperatives, into WhatsApp groups, into informative groups, into civil societies, new political wings. It changed the whole political landscape of this country. And the role of the young people were invaluable, and they will always be the root of this movement.
Thank you, Krystle. That was very insightful. And like you said, it all goes back to that one idea that there's no fear bigger than the fear of survival. So if that grips you as a nation, as a country, that leads to a movement against what you correctly pointed out was years long of frustration against political nepotism, the sort of luxury, as you mentioned, that the leadership or the old guard kind of enjoyed at the cost of the public. So, but that is what we see a bit of a through line when you look at what happened in Bangladesh and what happened in Nepal later. And you talked about how youth became very creative in order to share what they felt politically and economically about their future. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in our conversation today. But I think this is a good seg to you, Shah. So we just heard from Krystle about being, frustrated with the kind of system that the old guard was running. So turning to Bangladesh, 2024 was a watershed year. The student-led protests not only captured global attention, but also culminated in the end of Sheikh Hasina's long rule in a dramatic and turbulent moment that revealed the depth of youth frustration, again, with the political and economic direction of the country, and the sort of inequality that was there. And you've done extensive work on poverty alleviation and social equity as a youth leader yourself. Given everything that has unfolded in the past year and a half, how would you describe the dreams, the anxieties, and expectations of Bangladeshi youth today? And what future do they imagine for themselves and for the country? So over to you, Shah.
Thank you, Farwa. And I think Krystle mentioned a very key emotion over here, which is frustration. So the July uprising in 2024 in Bangladesh actually originated as a movement to reform the quota system here in Bangladesh, quota for government jobs, which offered stability to young people. And I think that sums up a lot of the frustration and expectations from the young people over here in Bangladesh. 40% of our population, which is around almost 200 million people, consists of young people. A large demographic which is unemployed, underserved, and underpaid. This is the demographic that has been frustrated throughout the years. Frustrated because it is a large untapped population with access to very limited opportunities. And I'll share a very recent example from last week. I had a volunteer coordinator of my organization come from southern Bangladesh to bid me farewell because he was leaving for Brazil to work in a poultry farm so that he can send less than $500 back to his family every month. Just for $500, he was moving all halfway across the world itself. He just had a kid just 2 weeks ago, whom he will probably not see for the next 2 years. And this is the frustration that we have in this country, especially for young people. The dreams and ambitions of young people in Bangladesh is quite simple. We want a safe and secure environment and space which gives us the opportunity to not only survive, but to grow and thrive with dignity so that people like Fahad, my volunteer coordinator, do not have to leave the country to seek better opportunities abroad. Why cannot we create those opportunities over here? We want to build a resilient Bangladesh where young people plays a fundamental role in national growth, innovation, and aspiration. The frustration that led to the movement back in 2024 still exists. That is why we're looking forward to the national elections right now, so that we can actually reshape this narrative where we're actually able to create better opportunities, not anywhere else in the world, but here in Bangladesh itself, because it's an untapped potential for not only the youth, but the country itself.
Thank you very much, Shah. Again, frustration being the key word here, reflecting back on what happened in 2024 with the job quota reform system, and then, as you mentioned, about the kind of brain drain the country is experiencing, or just how youth will have to just look at opportunities beyond their country for a more stable economic life to support their families, even for as low as what you mentioned, $500. But we We want to be able to see a more empowered youth, and that's exactly where we've seen the youth going toward, whether it's in Sri Lanka, whether it's in Bangladesh, and that's exactly where we saw movement in Nepal as well. So, Tanuja, I'm going to turn to you now. You were at the center of last year's Gen Z movement that began as a pushback against the government's social media ban and call for reforms, but quickly became a much bigger and more powerful statement about inequality. Again, a running theme here, and a political class that felt completely out of touch with young people's realities. So, from your frontline perspective, can you share with our audience what that enough is enough moment was for you and other young Nepalese in realizing that your futures were being compromised? And also, how do you see that moment shifting the youth's political consciousness, and how do you foresee change for good on the ground now? So, over to you, Tanuja.
What we saw on September 8th and September 9th is something that happened overnight. It's quite similar to Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, that it was the accumulation of frustration that people, not just JNG, but the entire population of Nepal have been feeling for a really long period of time. And I'm just 24 years old now, and my entire life I've seen the same people playing musical chair when it comes to power. And the general people of Nepal are paying the price of that. At the same time, the high-profile politicians, family are living their best life at the cost of our tax-paid money. And this time, I feel like it happened for good, that young Nepalese people were inspired by the Indonesia's movement, and they dared to speak against the incompetency of the government. And when young people participated in the global Nepo baby trend, the government of Nepal tried to suppress the dissent by banning the social media platform. They banned 26 social media platform, and they called it, we need regulations, we need to regulate the social media and stuff. But the timing was very suspicious. And that was the major cause. However, on 6th of September, there was this hit and run case by the provincial minister, Kar. And on the same day, our prime minister, he addressed the state, and he said that people should not make a big deal out of that hit and run case. And it was very insensitive of him to say such thing. And that was like enough is enough moment for me. And our social media campaign turned into a offline protest, and the rest is what we've been seeing in news. And regarding the changes or political awakening that happened after the JNG movement, there's good and bad side of it. The good side, I would like to focus on the positive side. In Nepal, my generation has always been leveled as a lazy generation, very apolitical generations, and always been politicians and other people, general people, they make taunt out of us, saying, they are the digital natives, and they don't understand the ongoing affairs of the state. And after this movement, the table have turned. Even this time, a lot of young people have given their candidacy for this upcoming election. Young people are debating, and they are having discussion on the major political dialogue, and they are also talking about the agenda that have been rejected by the old guards for a long period of time, such as out-of-country voting, and none of the above option in the election, and such thing. And not just that, our people, we are also pushing for the policy reform. And recently we had a 10 pact agreement with the government of Nepal. and which is also the outcome of the Change movement. And the good and on the bad side, there is a rise of populism. People are really frustrated, and some of the vested group are taking the advantage of it. And also the fact that young people are frustrated in such level that ideology no longer matters now in Nepal, which is one of the scary point. So yeah, that's the situation right now.
Thank you, Tanuja. It's helpful to know the evaluation of both the good side and the bad side, but certainly the movement, the political consciousness, the again frustration, another whole generation being frustrated with seeing the same sort of political class governing them, deciding their futures. Just propel them to do something about it, and not to be labeled lazy, but they'd certainly have a say, and they want to have a say, a more prominent one, as the future of the country gets determined, which decides their future. They are the brain, they're the lifeblood of the country and the future of not just, I'd say, Nepal, but the entire region. Same for Bangladesh, same for Sri Lanka. I'm going to go back to something that, Krystle, you talked about, again, being creative and going to other avenues to be able to express the political views and opinions. Again, the digital world has really benefited us a lot. There's a good side to it, there's a bad side to it, but we are living in a hyper digital world. And each of your countries, we saw how digital connectivity and social media could spark momentum. So whether it's in mobilizing people during the movements, whether it's about shaping public narratives or making local struggles visible to a larger global audience. So from where you're sitting, how do you see the digital world's power today? And equally, where do you see the limits, especially when it comes to the youth's role in politics and in determining sort of what the governance of the country is going to look like going forward? So I'm going to start with you, Krystle, then Shah, and then Tanuja, in that order.
Sure. So soon, as I mentioned, soon after the people's protest, the multiple surveys that carried, one thing that they were looking for is social media penetration during the protest. And what they found out was already more than 50% of the protesters were already using social media like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, especially for more crucial real-time information, for live streaming events, and also documenting important things. If not otherwise, would have been erased completely, because historically that's what happened. That's what has happened in this country. So this actually made it very effective to take the local struggles, not just to the not just nationally, but also internationally, across the borders. So one of the key things that happened during this time was the coordination that took place, especially during the time which we were under curfew, where there was emergency laws in place, there was internet shutdown, so we had to look at different avenues like using VPN, coordinating better amongst people coming together. And this was purely on social media that took place. And one of the main reasons, and I believe many Sri Lankans would agree to this, one of the reasons many protesters were unharmed in some way or even lived today to tell the story is because there was social media. When I say that, I do not mean that social media made us brave, because, again, another very common thing is that we are social justice warriors behind the keyboards. We are keyboard warriors, which is not what I'm implying. What I'm implying is we were able to archive violence and give more visibility to violence. So people are digitally archiving names, faces, locations. Violence still happened. People are still beaten. People are still arrested. I had friends, colleagues who were arrested, but what it couldn't happen was to the magnitude the authorities thought it would go to, because we are talking about a witness pool beyond the national borders. We're talking about thousands and millions of people witnessing the brutality that the protesters were going through with the regime then. Now, having said that, as you mentioned, it has its own limitations. There is still that digital divide, especially in South Asia as a region. It's still a privilege to have this kind of access, especially the rural youth, the women, And I work very closely with people with disabilities who doesn't even have the reasonable accommodation to use social media. So they still remain underrepresented in all of these conversations. So that's why it's important we look at how to make social media tool more equitable, more approachable and accessible for everyone so that no one feels like they've been left behind in these conversations. And other thing is that with social media, it's the misinformation and the disinformation that comes by default with it. The rumors, now with AI, all the content that is being generated, there could be so much of emotional triggers, and we have seen this happening now without warnings that could create much bigger tensions and chaos. So these are some of the areas that we need to kind of strike that balance between how we use social media into the greater good of humanity.
Thank you, Krystle. Over to you, Shah.
I think against for us here in Bangladesh, against guns, bullets, tanks, political manhandling, social media was our most powerful tool during the movement itself because of the information it was able to spread. And, for us, like we went through a 17-year regime under Sheikh Hasina where most of the traditional media outlets were under her influence. Like even if they wanted to, publish news regarding the movement, it would be stopped by Hasina's regime. And I think this gave birth to opportunities for other alternative platforms to be born. For example, when traditional news media failed, it was the bite-sized news platforms and guerrilla-based journalism that actually played a very big role in spreading information across to the masses. But then again, social media, as far as Krystle mentioned, it's like a Pandora's box. It has its good sides, but then it can have certain darkness to it as well. For us, Bangladesh, at least the masses in Bangladesh, can be considered as an emotional nation as well, right? And when it comes to, for example, using AI to spread misinformation or malinformation, it can be used to trigger certain populations towards mob mobility as well. Cases that we have seen over the last several months over here. So identifying those limitations and working towards how to understand between what is real and what is fake, which is actually becoming more difficult as the days go by. Even now, I myself face difficulty. At least I have to check twice whether a video is real or not in that sense. We have to figure out ways in identifying and spreading the right information to the masses so that it doesn't cause more harm than good. Because right now we've already achieved what we wanted to achieve. Now we want to rebuild the nation itself. We don't want distractions. And social media, as bad it may sound, can create those distractions if we are not too careful about it as well. So that is something that we must pay attention to immediately right now.
Thank you, Shah. Tanuja, over to you. Do you agree with what Krystle and Shah just shared?
Yeah, I have similar stand on it. When it comes to Nepal, the government of Nepal has always treated only Kathmandu as a Nepal, and the rest of the places were quite unapproachable to Kathmandu and the civic space we have in Kathmandu. So social media has been a civic space to a lot of youngsters in Nepal where they discuss and held dialogue on the ongoing political and non-political things, basically. And the social media is not just limited to the civic space. It is also a mean of connectivity because we have the greater diaspora where the people use social media to connect with. And also recently, a lot of youngsters, their major source of income is also social media and the other online businesses. So I think social media is quite important and very powerful tool for young Nepalese. However, it's not everything. And I believe that social media can never be the substitute to the real world organizing. And because we can see like how the algorithm works and how algorithm prioritize one narrative over another, and how it restrict people from knowing the truth, and that these things has been quite visible and clear today's as well. So, like Krystle mentioned, the misinformation and disinformation, and we don't have any tool to control that or to fact check the things. And at the same time, it's quite scary how social media prioritize the viral content over the truth. So this is the limitation. And another thing I agree with Krystle is that in Nepal, even though in Nepal around 43 populations are familiar to the online platform or social media, there's still a huge digital divide. And social media, if we prioritize social media's voice over the real world organizing, it would be very unfair to the marginalized communities where there is a huge digital divide.
Thank you. Thank you very much all for sharing your thoughts on that. Of course, the digital divide is very real. It kind of reflects the larger divide in the region that we see, where the women, the marginalized communities don't have the same access to education, same access to health, and likewise same access to technology. And as we, as very much there's this privilege of having access to social media and other digital instruments to be able to share your opinion. Not everyone gets to have a say in that. And so that is, again, another area that actively the population needs to work, the government needs to work toward. But the flip side of social media, the flip side of AI is that there's, like Shah mentioned, there's this dark side. And so it's become very important to use these mediums responsibly and for the greater good. And there are good examples, Tanuja, you mentioned a lot of economic opportunities come out of social media for people, but not to go into the virality of things, not to go into clickbaity things. I think so that's a lot of responsibility. Again, one thing that we all can work towards together. But I want to also talk about, because we want to get this conversation towards the elections that are coming up as well. But I want to get all of your thoughts on leadership. Let's just talk good leadership. If you had to redefine the idea of good leadership for the 21st century South Asian context, what values or practices would you elevate that are currently missing from political life in the region? So again, if we can go in that same order, we'll start with Krystle, and we'll come to Shah, and then finally Tanuja.
Sure. So before we talk about the political leadership, what we need to see is how leadership is seen overall in South Asia. So generally, when we talk about leadership, it's something to do with more louder than the other person, or this is someone above the law, or someone who has more immunity from accountability. So this is the first narrative that we need to break, right? Because we as young people, what we are demanding is for more purposeful leadership, right? We are talking about no dynasties in disguise of democracies, to have better meritocracy over family legacies. Because, recently I was reading a report called the Youth Pulse by the World Economic Forum, and it said 50% of the world population, although we are under the age of 30, only 2.8% are parliamentarians globally who are under the age of 30. Now, the issue here is, the gap here is not because we don't have the interest. We do have the interest. It's just structurally there is a failure in our political system, right? And this can only be addressed if the leadership is open for more intergenerational conversations, better dialogues around foresight, and including us in these conversations as solution makers. The other thing is leaders, especially in South Asia, they need to understand their role is to service. They are here to serve a community, serve the citizens of this country. If your motorcade is going to cost more than the maternity ward in a national hospital, I don't see that person as a leader. That's just a logistical problem for me. So we need to address these kind of things, which one may think as petty, but it's not. This is where the problem starts with. Yes, it's important for your security, but you also have to have, you have to have sanity over vanity, is what I'm saying. So, and the other important thing is when it comes to leadership, there has to be diversity. There had to be better representation of leaders, not just we are talking about people from minority groups, people from indigenous groups to many other diverse groups that we have. Because diversity and inclusion isn't easy, but it is definitely doable. So that's a kind of change of narrative I would like to see in leadership when it comes to South Asia.
Thank you, Krystle. Shah, over to you.
I think Krystle mentioned a lot of the points that I wanted to, but I want to emphasize on that one part. In my own opinion, I find politics in South Asia to be very aggressive, very aggressive, very loud, based on like blaming. And it's usually about, when it comes to the elections, it's about selecting one of the lesser evil, usually, because it's always about blame gaming, right? I believe politics in South Asia misses the one fundamental thing that every politician should do, which is to listen and understand what the community wants. If I'm a politician, if I want to be voted, I should go on and ask people around that if I become your representative, what can I do for you? And this is one fundamental thing that is missing, at least from politicians in the general conception here in Bangladesh. And politics needs to be about building an ideology which isn't destructive, about blaming or aggressive itself, but which truly promotes the well-being of each and every citizen of the nation itself. Politics shouldn't be about self-interest. And as Krystle mentioned, it should be about the act of service itself, because that is the entire definition of being a politician at the end of the day. So the most important part is to listen. And that is what we need to instill, about listening and holding accountability to the masses that we want to serve.
So doing by listening, that should be the exercise that most leaders should be doing. Absolutely. And I think before we go to Tanuja for her thoughts, one thing that I'm hearing is you need to have, and that's exactly what the youth are trying to do, you need to have the youth as stakeholders in any sort of decision making. So before you get to policy making, you hear from all the stakeholders who will be impacted by those policies, and that's where the listening part comes in. Tanuja, over to you.
I agree with both of them because it's quite similar here. I think in South Asia, politics, it usually revolve around personalities and patronage and not on the ideology and vision. That's where the problem lies. I think South Asia has a long history of hero-making culture. We see politician as God rather than a public servant. So I think that's where the problem lies. So if I could elevate anything, I would elevate the integrity over this charisma, and then service over the self-interest, and accountability over the patronage, basically.
Thank you, Tanuja. Yeah, I think there is a lot of personality-driven politics in the region, but also globally, we're seeing that being quite the case. But I just want to remind everyone who's joined us to please send in your questions and through your the Zoom Q&A box in front of you on the Zoom screen. We'll just come to them soon after I have another round of questions for Tanuja and Shah here. So just following up from the previous question where we discussed leadership, we have elections coming up, pivotal elections in Bangladesh, Nepal can be very transformative for the two countries. So how are the youth looking at the upcoming election cycles? I think Tanuja, you kind of touched a little bit on that earlier in your one of your responses, but in each of your countries, how does that outlook look like? And if you could set the top three policy priorities for the next government based on what young people are demanding? If they were to listen to young people, what would those policy priorities be and why? So, Tanuja and then Shah.
Like I said before, I see this election with lots of hope and deep caution, and with the deep caution because it's not just a Delhi election. It's not a casual election we have before. It's also about the justice to our fallen friends and the investigations on the vandalism and the arson that took place on 9th of September in Nepal. So it's quite special to all the Nepalese. And about what we want to see, three priorities. It's quite a hard question because it's quite hard to summarize so many things in 3 points. I think the first thing would be our foreign policy. Though Nepal have a very good foreign policy on paper, however, our foreign policy could never be our state policy. The political parties policies has been our state foreign policy. So it's I would, if I could re-elevate the policy things, I would say that I would definitely prioritize the foreign policy. Next is the governance, accountability, and end to the impunity. That was the core demand of the JNG movement that took place in Nepal, and the 10 pact agreement we had with government is quite related to this policy. And third would be the social and economic justice policy. Even, like I said, we have a very good policy when it comes to paper, but we need its implementation. And the protest that we saw on September was also for the implementation of that matter.
All right. So since the birth of Bangladesh in 1971, it has been a musical chair of governments and political parties that have taken advantage of people over and over again. And this election that we're going to be having on 12th February is going to be a historical election for us because so many young people gave their lives so that we could, take back our right and not only vote, but hold leaders accountable in this end. And what we want from this election is a government that actually truly cares about the well-being and growth of our people and addresses exactly the frustration that we've been having, not only for the last 1.5 years or 17 years, but ever since our birth as well. And the three policies that we need to focus on in Bangladesh, at least in my opinion, should be at first, law enforcement and security. Second would be on education and employment. And the third one, which is a very uncommon one, would be environment and climate, which would be about improving the air quality, about energy transition, improving the waste management facility on a national basis itself, because we need to create an environment where people can truly thrive itself. So I believe that these three policy changes would be fundamental in building the Bangladesh that we truly want to see in the future.
Thank you both. I think those are very pertinent points. Social and economic equality, justice, education, healthcare, very important for the region overall, very important for these countries. They're graduating. Bangladesh and Nepal both are set to graduate from the LDC status later this year. There is, of course, a growing youth population, and all of these are very important policy ideas and reforms that would be necessary in determining what the future looks like. But one thing, since you mentioned environment and climate, I also get Krystle's thoughts on that because, Sri Lanka just experienced a devastating cyclone just last year. So, Krystle, how is the youth in Sri Lanka feeling about the country's environmental and climate policies in terms of disaster risk rehabilitation? What's the situation there like?
Yeah, sure. So something that we fail to address, especially as a leadership, is to creating more inclusive disaster resilient plans. What over and over again, what we see is annually we go through the floods, annually we go through some kind of a cyclone. We know when it's happening. We know that climate change is hitting us hard as an island, but there is no steps taken in to prevent it. It's only reactive at this point, and even if it's reactive, as I mentioned, the plans in place don't really cater to a much larger population in this country. Now, for example, we have an aging population, unlike in India, I would say, at this point. So the elderly population must be included in these discussions. They need to understand how to evacuate them in these crisis situations. It cannot be thought as an afterthought. It has to be thought before. That's why I say the conversation around foresight. What are we going to do in the years to come? What is that national policy around environment? And this is something extremely lacking right now in Sri Lanka. And I'm hoping the recent catastrophe the country faced would at least make the government make that first step of change and create a more robust national policy around it.
Thank you, Krystle. Yeah, certainly. It's very important to have more training, some more inclusion in terms of, what can we do when crises like this strikes. We've seen this episode in Pakistan. We see that, unfortunately, it's a bit of a routine occurrence in this part of the world. But there's also a question about foreign policy. So I'll just try to merge it into a question that I already have for all of you here, which is about young people's take on regional cooperation. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on that because, South Asia is a region that has so many shared opportunities and challenges. We talked about climate. That's one prominent one. There are economic pressures that are quite similar. And there are other sort of cultural and social norms that bind the region together. So from your perspective, what would be a more youth-centered model of regional cooperation and how can young people across the region help a South Asian future that's more connected and more responsive to shared risks and prospects and less divided by politics, which often tends to be the case. So Tanuja, let's start with you and then Shah and then Krystle.
Yeah. I think that it's high time that the permanent South Asian Youth Assembly should be formed for the people for South Asia because the growing geopolitical and cross-boundary tension is quite worrying. Even in Nepal, every time, I'm relating this to climate change, every time when the massive flood hits Nepal, it's Bihar who'd suffer as well. And at the same time, the communal tension grows, like people blame each other for the flood and the stuff. And so I think it's high time. And I feel like our all cooperation and talks are limited and trapped to the summit room, and we are not being able to convert it into a live reality. So we, as a young people, we don't have a common platform where we can connect with each other and where we can regularly communicate and also have our own regional identity. So I feel like it's a high time we should envision something like a permanent South Asian Youth Assembly, which could give young people not just to be the agency, but also give the power to decide what they envision collectively when it comes to South Asia.
Thank you, Tanuja. Shah?
When I see African countries united as one Africa, I do feel jealous in that sense because as the subcontinent itself, we have so much potential to work together and grow together as well. And our unity can lead to tremendous potential for people in all the countries involved in South Asia. However, I also believe that relationships need to be based on cooperation, based on equal partnership, and not based on control, dominance, or hegemony at the end of the day. Mutual respect, diplomacy, and cohesion will take us a long way based on the power of our people and resources. If you look at the subcontinent together, it's a massive population and it's a massive potential itself. And we did have an opportunity with SARC, right? And I feel like SARC should be revitalized so that we can start the common dialogue between our own people. It's our own people are, as well over here. So we have to stop bickering amongst ourselves, but we also have to work together on equal footing. And I think that should be the message across, that we should be working equally together for a better future for all at the end of the day.
Thank you, Shah. One thing that one of my earlier mentors had said, and it's still stuck with me, is diplomacy should not be left to just diplomats. And I think that's where all of our role becomes very important in supporting regional cooperation, especially when there are so many issues that divide us. And you talked about climate, there are other challenges, transboundary issues. I worked a lot on water. The need for cooperation in every single sector, it just tops anything that makes competition feel like the more likable route to take from a policy perspective. So why not favor something that can actually bring gains to population on all sides? So, Krystle.
Sure. So I definitely concur with both Tanuja and Shah on what they've shared already, right? So as a region, we are so diverse. We are resourceful. We have the harder powers to the softer powers in this region, yet we've not tapped into that full potential because of our own differences, the polarization that has happened because the ideologies of our political leaders. Now, just like Shah mentioned about Africa, if we talk about the European Union, you see how countries have come together for better movement within the region, for supporting trade, for supporting livelihood. If that is something that we as SAARC countries can do, right, that would be one easy way of coming out of many of the problems we have. Because most of our problems across the board are very common, from unstable economies to unstable climate risks that we are facing right now, the job insecurity, etc. So the point is that we need to find a common ground, and that is where we have really missed our opportunity. We together can create one of the biggest supply chains in the world today, yet because of our own differences, we are not stepping into that agreement or coming into a common ground. I believe the last SAARC, the leaders summit, happened back in 2014, almost more than 10 years ago. This is pre-COVID. What is really happening? So the frustration of the young people today is that we don't believe our current leaders have what it takes to plan for our future. And that's why we want better representation, a quota system that can bring us to the big table to have this conversation, to co-design with them, because this is something that is imminent at this point. And just like Tanuja mentioned, we need to have better climate resilient projects across this region. Our problems are very similar, floods from Pakistan to India to Sri Lanka to everywhere else. And we see this as a very common issue. And also regional civic platforms. Right now, this conversation that we are having is a sample of what can really happen in a much larger scale, as Tanuja mentioned, in a diplomatic space where youth is involved. So this is the kind of conversation that must happen, because we can't leave behind young people of this region and create policies around them. And that's where we have failed before. And if we are to really correct it, the change must happen right now as we speak, because we are not talking about any symbolic changes. We're talking about bringing us into influencing decisions regarding this region. And that's where I stand with this.
Thank you, Krystle. And you're right to point out SAARC. Unfortunately, we've not seen SAARC do much or be proactive in the past decade or longer. So that demise has been very unfortunate for regional cooperation. But I know Chief Advisor Mohammed Yunus is a big proponent of reviving SAARC as a means for regional cooperation. So we'll see what the next generation or current generation could do to help platforms like SAARC or maybe find new modalities, but the end goal being that you cooperate for the greater good within the region. Tanuja, there's a question for you. How do you see youth leadership play a role in reducing the entrenched politicization of nearly every sector in Nepal? It's a question we've gotten from one of our audience members.
I think the responsibility lies not just in youth, but the entire population. After GNG movement, general people of Nepal, they have shifted all the responsibility to the GNG soldier. But having said so, I think refraining from the politics from patronage to public service was one of the motto of GNG movement. And even after the GNG movement, we have mobilized in every sector. We have demanded for the internal democracy within the existing political party. And one of the positive change that happened after the GNG movement and after our lobbying is that the Nepali Congress, one of the oldest political party of Nepal, held its first special convention, and it took the ownership of the agreement that we had with the government of Nepal, and by bypassing the old guards of Nepali Congress, Gagan Thapa, the current president, one of the young leader of Nepali Congress, is now the president, and they have also come up with the provisions like the fixed term for the party president, fixed term for the prime ministership in Nepal. And I think this is one of the positive change that we have seen recently. Besides this, there's also a lot of lobbying going around by the young people of Nepal regarding the culture of against the culture of power sharing. And after this movement, a lot of political parties are questioning their internal democracy and questioning their leaders, which was not seen before the movement. And I think we are going on a right track.
Thank you, Tanuja. There's also a question about why, we have not seen youth-led movements in other parts of the region where similar inequalities run or sort of similar frustrations run. So I think that just brings me to a question: was there any learning from one another? So was Shah, what happened in Bangladesh? Do you think there was any sort of inspiration from what you saw as the people's protest in Sri Lanka? Just the strength of what the common man can do if they gather together for a cause they feel strongly about. Likewise, Tanuja, was there anything that you think you picked up from both what you saw in Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh? So Shah, let's get your thoughts on that first.
I think from the movement itself, like there was a lot of learning opportunities for us. The last 1.5 years hasn't been very easy, and a lot of previous mistakes were unfortunately repeated as well. It's a young nation, and there have been times where we could have been better as well. But we are also in the learning phase right now. That is why the election is so important to us, because for the last 1.5 years, a lot of us tried our best. But what we realized is that we need to have a proper government to ensure that the economy is able to run well, and we are able to reestablish on certain issues that have been bothering us for the last 1.5 years. As I've mentioned, because of the absence of proper law enforcement and security, because the law enforcement agencies were based off the previous regime's people, at least a huge chunk of it. What happened was that now we have an absence of that essential facility within our country at this point. So reestablishing that, as well as like working on the education, employment policies, is going to be very important for us. And as I said, we are going to be making a lot of mistakes as we go on, but the key is to not give up and have hope, because I do have hope for Bangladesh that we will be able to recover from whatever problem that we are facing as well. And as you know, like one of the biggest challenges that Bangladesh has faced, even before the movement itself, was the absence of a proper political ideology, meaning that in that space where political representatives were not actually going to the last mile, reaching the common people, a certain fundamentalistic narrative has been created, which we are trying to tackle from over here as well. In the absence of proper political ideology, fundamentalism takes place. At least that's what we've seen in the last 1.5 years. But we're going to be doing our best to address this as the years go by, because we believe that a golden future awaits for Bangladesh itself in the most secular way possible, at least.
Thank you very much, Shah. Very quickly, Tanuja, your thoughts, brief thoughts.
Actually, we have picked up the movement itself. So thank you to the Sri Lankans and Bangladeshi youth for the courage that they have shown. And also to the Indonesian youth. I feel like we are connected by the cause, even though we are separated by the border, and the fight has been quite similar the entire time. We are also learning on how the into Bangladesh's young people they came up with the demand of the nepalese and we learned from them. And even though it took a while for Bangladesh to declare the election, and we Nepalese we learned from Bangladesh's mistake. That's why we are pushing for the fair and free election. So yeah, thank you. I would just want to say thank you for all the courage that you guys have shown to us and to the entire world.
Well, thank you, Tanuja. On that note, we've reached the end of our hour. In fact, we're a little over, but this has been incredibly informative, incredibly insightful. I've learned a lot from our speakers today. Thank you very much, Krystle, Tanuja, and Shah, for joining me. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your very valuable input. Thank you, everyone in the audience. Your participation has definitely made this conversation all the more engaging. Please stay in touch with the Asia Society Policy Institute, subscribe to our newsletters, and keep watching this space for more.